Today we're on the banks of the Medway estuary to try and find the remains of a shipwreck that cost the lives of nearly 800 men. It was the morning of Thursday the 26th of November 1914. Some of the crew of the HMS Bulwark were on board having breakfast, some were drilling on the deck, and the sound of the band could be heard playing on board. Then suddenly, without warning, the men, the band, the entire ship disappeared behind a sheet of flame. We'll try and find out what happened, why it happened, and ultimately try to remember the boys and men, some of them were 15 years old, who lost their lives in an instant out there in the water. This is the tragic loss of the HMS Bulwark.
So, before we get to the events of that initially calm November morning, here's a little pre-World War I context, just to kind of paint a picture of what was happening in the world and Britain at the time. Well, it's the early 1900s, and Europe is basically one big powder keg with a frilly moustache. Everyone's building armies, signing shady alliances, and most importantly for this story, massively beefing up their navies. Now, Britain, being a fancy little island nation with a lot to lose, decides that it's not just going to have a navy, it's going to have the navy. As in, enough ships to slap down anyone who even thinks about challenging it. Britain has long been the island nation equivalent of the short guy at the pub, who needs to let everyone know that he might be small, but he's got the biggest balls, and he won't hesitate to teabag you if you even think about mentioning that suspicious black eye that his wife had at the supermarket last week. Now, this obsession hit full throttle in 1906 when Britain launched HMS Dreadnought. She was faster, stronger, and packed more firepower than any battleship that had come before. And she was so popular and successful that the name basically became a brand. And after that, every new ship was either a dreadnought or it was irrelevant. At that point, and after it had proven its success, enter Germany stage left, twirling their evil moustaches and going, "Yeah, we will take 10 of those." And thus began a naval arms race. Two superpowers in a floating flex-off, churning out bigger ships with bigger guns, and unfortunately, much bigger accidents waiting to happen. And whilst these nations were focused on building these shiny new boats, the older ships, or what generally at that point had become known as the pre-dreadnoughts, were still there, plugging away, doing whatever they could. And HMS Bulwark was just one of those. A London-class pre-dreadnought battleship that was launched in 1899. I have actually seen online that at her launch she created such a huge wave that it actually destroyed a temporary jetty that had been set up so people could watch. And apparently 30 spectators drowned, but I've not been able to confirm that. Apparently there is video footage. I couldn't find it. If you know where that is, let me know, because that would be fascinating to see. But if that's true, then that would make HMS Bulwark an incredibly unlucky ship. And she was finally completed, made ready for service in 1902, and she was assigned to the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet as the flagship. The flagship, in case you don't know, being the lead or command vessel where the commander is. And usually, because that boat is the largest, the fastest, the most well-armed, or just, the best known. From 1907 to 1910, she served with the Channel and Home fleets, again often serving as the flagship of those fleets. And after this, she was moved into reserve for the Home fleet. And that's where she stayed until this little blip, this little historical blip that we call World War I. So at this point, the naval arms race had left ships like the Bulwark kind of somewhat at the back of the pack. So she wasn't sent anywhere fancy, but she was attached to the Channel Fleet as protection for the British Expeditionary Force, who were heading over to France to help make up the Western Front. The war had begun in August 1914, and by the time November rolled around, concerns were growing about a potential German invasion of Great Britain. And that is how we find HMS Bulwark moored in the Medway estuary on the 26th of November, 1914. It's around 7:50 a.m, and Bulwark along with several other ships, is moored peacefully just off Kingsnorth in the Medway estuary. The crew's leave had ended at 7 a.m, which meant that at this point she had her full complement aboard, which was, depending on where you look, around 750 to 800 men. Now, men are having their breakfast, those who are already up and ready to go are running drills on the deck, and the naval band is playing. All in all, it's about as calm and pleasant a morning as you can imagine a few months into a global war. Then, everything changed. The Times reported the following later that day.
Early this morning, the Bulwark lay peacefully at anchor in the Medway. Other ships of war lay close beside her. The band was playing, and some of the men were drilling on deck when the explosion occurred. A great sheet of flame and quantities of debris shot upwards, and the huge bulk of the vessel lifted and sank, shattered, torn, and twisted, with officers and men aboard.
The huge explosion was heard as far away as Whitstable to the south and Southend to the north. Debris and personal items from the crew on board rained down in the streets of Sheerness, and it was even reported that debris had fallen on the Isle of Sheppey almost 4 miles away. The blast was so significant that it was reported that some of those on the Isle of Sheppey and some of those on the mainland assumed that a Zeppelin raid had begun and the invasion of Great Britain was underway. But when there were no further explosions and there was no follow-up defensive fire, it became clear that something else had gone terribly, terribly wrong. And once the smoke had cleared, the ship was gone.
Me and my dad are just off to try and find the Bulwark. Now it's somewhere off over there. We think we can see something else as well that might be interesting. So there might be a nice little surprise down there as well. We'll find out. If you watched the Staplehurst train crash video, you will know that I'm a big fan of having to go across railway lines. It's one of my favourite pastimes, as you can imagine. And we found another one. We're going to have to cross this to get to where we need to go to try and find the Bulwark. So, fun times. All right, we couldn't get over the railway line. The gate was locked. And as much as we want to go over there and film it, I don't think trespassing is the best option. So we're going to go further up and see if we can find another place to get a little bit closer. All right, attempt 2 to find the Bulwark. And we've actually found a really nice little church. Cute little church in, where are we? Upper Stoke. Upper Stoke. Loves a church. All right, proof that we are now on a legitimate footpath. Nobody trespassing here. We've made it. We're apparently in the best spot right here, apart from actually going out to it, to be able to see the Bulwark, or the boys marking where the Bulwark wreck is. We met a lovely guy called Tony, who's clearly the boss here. He's clearly in charge, who basically told us exactly where to come to be able to get the best view of it. So thank you, Tony. If you ever come here, ask for Tony. He's the best. Let's see if we can spot the Bulwark. So, great success. We managed to find some buoys that we think might be the Bulwark. We're pretty sure they are. I'm pretty sure there's one marking either end of the ship. But there's not a lot else out there, so that's all it really could be.
Nothing but debris remained above the surface, and that debris started causing massive problems for the rescue efforts, which had begun almost immediately. The Bulwark had been moored close to several other Navy vessels, all of whom immediately launched boats to try and look for survivors. The water, however, was a complete mess. The surface was absolutely covered with bits of wood, boxes, furniture, anything that would float, and that included some of the remains of the victims. Now, miraculously, despite the size of the blast, none of the other ships nearby suffered any damage or casualties. The same could not be said for the Bulwark. The ship had not just exploded, it had been obliterated. When divers were sent to find the wreck on the 29th of November, they reported that the ship's port bow, as far aft as the sickbay, had been blown off by the explosion and lay about 50 feet or 15 metres east of where she'd been moored, and the starboard bow lay 30 feet or 9 metres further away. Everything in between had been utterly blown apart, and the only other significant piece of debris that was found was a 12-inch gun that was discovered 2 days later, some distance away. And the crew? A total of around 750 men were lost instantly. 788 if you look at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database. Enjoying a normal morning one moment, and gone the next. And of those almost 800 men, only around 30 bodies were ever recovered. Now, around 14 men survived the initial blast, but obviously most of them had severe injuries and would succumb to their wounds over the following days. Incredibly though, some of those survivors escaped completely unscathed. It would seem that they'd perhaps been blown clear of the ship by some smaller detonations just before the main one that destroyed it. One of these survivors was able seaman Marshall, who described feeling a colossal draft that blew him away from the ship. And as he was falling, he remembered seeing the Bulwark's masts shaking violently. Witnesses aboard the HMS Implacable, which was another pre-dreadnought moored alongside, described the following.
A huge pillar of black cloud belched upwards, was followed by a thunderous roar, and then came a series of lesser detonations, and finally, one vast explosion that shook the Implacable from mastheads to keel.
Tragically, there were also 6 15-year-old sailors among the dead. Midshipman William Ellis, signal boy Benjamin Spencer, Midshipman Evelyn Williamson, bugler Philip Bullen, boy first class William Kello, and Midshipman Charles Wilson.
Okay, you now find us in Woodland Cemetery in Gillingham, which is where some of the remains that were recovered from the Bulwark were laid to rest. So we're going to go and try and find the naval section of the cemetery, because it is a big, big cemetery, as always. But this time we're not looking for one grave, we're looking for a bunch, so it should be slightly easier to find. Okay, over there you can see that we didn't have to search for too long to find the naval cemetery, or the naval section, because those are all the headstones. So let's see if we can find the memorial for the Bulwark.
Around the back as well, you've got a couple of really big slabs.
Well, we found it. It is probably the largest memorial in terms of just ground covered here. And that's because under our feet here are 70 sailors from the HMS Bulwark, and also actually 10 from the Princess Irene that also exploded off Sheerness. I'll probably look into that at some point as well. And this is always, as always, is such a haunting reminder that these were real people. It's all well and good seeing these huge figures, seeing 800 men died, but when you're actually here and you know that, yeah, they're here too, they're under the ground, it is an important reminder that these are real people with real families and friends. And this is how we remember them. Okay, my dad just made an interesting point that we're not in an official military cemetery here, but there are still so many graves, and it's just, I think, a good reminder that how dangerous it is to be in the military, because a lot of these are not wartime graves. A lot of these are outside of war, so accidents, things like that, and there are still just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of graves here. Every single one of these headstones was a single person. Could have been someone you know, a friend, a loved one, anyone. Every single one of these people was a human being, and in a lot of cases, a young human being, you know, somebody at the beginning of their life. And this is where they ended up.
Ultimately, the loss of the HMS Bulwark is remembered still as one of the most catastrophic accidental explosions in the history of the United Kingdom. The only one worse being the explosion of the dreadnought battleship Vanguard 3 years later. In the afternoon after the explosion, news had reached London and Winston Churchill, who at that point was First Lord of the Admiralty. And in a statement made in the House of Commons, he said the following.
I regret to say I have some bad news for the House. The Bulwark battleship, which was lying in Sheerness this morning, blew up at 7:53 o'clock. The Vice and Rear Admirals who were present have reported their conviction that it was an internal magazine explosion which rent the ship asunder. There was apparently no upheaval in the water, and the ship had entirely disappeared when the smoke had cleared away. An inquiry will be held tomorrow, which may possibly throw more light on the occurrence. The loss of the ship does not sensibly affect the military position, but I regret to say the loss of life is very severe. Only 12 men are saved. All the officers and the rest of the crew, who I suppose amounted to between 700 and 800, have perished. I think the House would wish me to express on their behalf the deep sorrow with which the House heard the news, and their sympathy with those who have lost their relatives and friends.
After HMS Bulwark disappeared in a fireball that basically lit up half of Kent, the Admiralty was scrambling to find out what went wrong. The press was sniffing around, the local public was stunned, and the Navy were just desperately trying to not look like amateurs. The initial theory was sabotage. Obviously, this was country at war. Rear Admiral E.F. Gaunt told the inquest into the disaster that Bulwark had suffered an accidental internal explosion. They suspected that hot ashes had been piled up against the bulkhead that separated the boiler room from a magazine. In addition to this, it seemed that shells and other ammunition had been piled up in the corridors. Now, this was very much against regulations at the time, but Gaunt suggested that a huge portion of the Bulwark's crew had been made up by reservists. Obviously, we're only a few months into the war, so there's a lot of fresh faces here, and that maybe they hadn't been caught up on the current regulations. And when the crew was called to breakfast at 7:45 a.m. that day, that ammunition, those hot ashes, would have been left up against that boiler room bulkhead, which, as the boilers were kicked up at the start of the day, would have been getting hotter and hotter. Translation: someone left exposed explosives next to a hot wall, and things went about as badly as you'd expect. Now, cordite, the main propellant used in British naval guns, was notoriously volatile. Think of it as military-grade spaghetti noodles soaked in nitroglycerin. And that is what it's reported that the sailors on the Bulwark were moving around the corridors and leaving exposed to the elements. And one of the points of the Board of Inquiry was to reinforce that no cordite charges should be handled in that way, especially not in the vicinity of the magazines aboard a ship. And cordite does have a bit of a history with the British Navy around that time and earlier. It was definitely not something to be handled lightly, and definitely not the way it was being handled aboard the Bulwark. So, in short, discipline had slipped, procedures were being ignored, and the result was the worst home front naval disaster in British history up to that point. It seems like once those charges had started to ignite, they set off a bunch of small explosions through the corridors of the Bulwark, which ignited the magazines across the ship and blew the whole thing sky high. That would explain the series of smaller explosions and the one big one that was witnessed by the sailors on the Implacable. It's sad, really, that outside of military historians and enthusiasts and nerds like me, I don't think many people know about this tragedy. When I was doing the research, there are articles out there, like small articles on personal blogs, a few things on Navy, military history-based sites, but there's nothing huge out there. And it does make you wonder whether it's not because of a lack of interest, but perhaps a lasting legacy of how the disaster was treated at the time. Now, it was wartime and there was a lot going on, but outside of the inquiry immediately afterwards, not a lot else was said about the Bulwark. And it does make you wonder whether the Navy, the Admiralty, whoever, were kind of trying to hush it up a little bit. Because, I mean, an enemy attack is one thing, sabotage is just as bad, but the loss of almost 800 men and boys to something as horrifyingly simple as human error or of rules and regulations not being followed, that's something else. And it's probably not something the British Navy and the government wanted broadcast across the nation and the world at the very start of World War I. Let's just say it probably wouldn't have been stellar for morale. I mean, part of Churchill's statement even kind of gives away what the general attitude from those in power was to this. He said, "The loss of the ship does not sensibly affect the military position," before he went on to mention the 800 victims. And so the Bulwark just became another in a long list of horrible events from the First World War. And happened so soon into the war, so much else happened afterwards that it kind of, again, just as it did when the dreadnoughts arrived, got left at the back of the pack. But 750 men still died.
Well, I thought we'd come here and just find the memorial to the Bulwark, and that would be, that would be hard-hitting. That would be an important reminder of the scale of this loss here, the fact that there are just 70 people buried in the ground here in front of me. I mean, that's basically a tenth of the people who died in this disaster. It's mind-blowing. These were people who lost their lives in a meaningless conflict, and in a meaningless accident in a meaningless conflict. It is just, it's heartbreaking. And then you look around and you see the number of other graves here and you just think, what are we doing, humanity, what are we doing? Just failing continually. It never ends. It's also really touching to see the number of headstones here that have family members, mums, dads, that actually chose to be buried here with their children, partners, whoever it happened to be that was important to them. And they decided, after living for, decades longer, that they still wanted to be reunited with their family members. Again, just shows you that the families never forget, and neither should we.
Bit of a sad one today, but still, I hope you enjoyed it, because it's so important to remember these stories, remember these tragedies, and not to let them get lost in history or drowned out by the amount of chaos and tragedy that was also going on around them. So with that, I hope you did enjoy it. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.